Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is a wonderful crowd. I'm Corinne Salcedo. This is Fidalgo Democrats. We have a lot of new people. Our program tonight is called Hanford's Unintended Consequences, the Cleanup Nightmare. And our speaker is Bud Anderson. I'll be introducing him in just a little while. Barbara Cooper made the coffee, and Rita Sullivan the cookies. Just help yourself. And Zane Butler is this young man. He's going to videotape the meeting, and then provide me with a YouTube link that I'll send out to all our membership. So you can watch it again if you like.
I got some business cards over here too.
Oh,
Really? It's on the table.
he just graduated from high school and already has business cards. He's going places. And he wants to be a videographer. He already is one.
Thank you.
And our newsletter is what you see on the sign-in table. I always bring 25 hard copies for those who don't have email or who prefer to read a hard copy. So help yourself. We're an independent club. We don't charge any dues. We just pass the hat or the basket, whatever it is. I think tonight it's a basket. Doreen will pass it later on. Do we have any public officials or candidates here that I could introduce?
No, there's one. I saw her come in.
Oh, Jackie, stand up. Say who you are.
I'm Jackie Brunson. Oh my gosh, hi Will.
Yeah.
Skagit County Treasurer. I've been in office for 10 months now.
Yay.
Thanks for all of your support getting there. We've made a lot of changes, and don't forget to pay your property tax. Next week is the deadline. So anyhow, thank you.
And then Will Rucker, our former sheriff, is here. Stand and say no, you want to see you. We always enjoy it when he comes. And how about Democratic Party officials? Jeff Mount is not here. He's in Italy. Bob Dahl is not here. I don't think we do. And Patty Santangelo has campaign materials back there on the...
That's actually Democrat materials. They don't have campaign materials until after the convention. So we don't take sides beforehand.
Okay, so what do you have?
I have bumper stickers and buttons that are generally for Democrats who are voting tolerance, select Social Security, thank a Democrat, and a number of buttons as well.
Okay.
Here for all.
All right. And Teresa Baker, thank you, is going to make an announcement. Where is she? So come on up, Teresa. Well, that would be better. So they can hear you, but careful of all these cords.
Yeah. It's not a big announcement, it's just that we have formed a Warren for President committee here in Anacortes, so anybody who's interested in that, and my number and my compatriot Megan Blancy's number is in the
Newsletter.
The newsletter.
Very bottom.
Yeah, thank you. We'll be at the farmer's market this Saturday.
You want to say what's tomorrow night?
No, because I can't have that.
Oh, okay then. It'll be a secret.
Yeah, we're just having a little meeting at my house tomorrow for some few people to show them how to use the apps that go with campaigning.
But if you want to work in the Warren campaign, contact her. You can call her. The phone number's in the newsletter. And Jackie Anderson is going to pass around materials for No More Bombs. And, sorry, Rita Sullivan has a petition to pass. She'll come and explain.
Each of the presidential candidates to qualify for the March 10th primary here in Washington need signatures on a petition. So I have one for Pete Buttigieg. If you sign this, it's not an endorsement, and you can assign as many of the presidential petitions as you want, so you're not locked into anything, but this just will help him qualify for the March 10th primary. So I'd appreciate it if you could do it. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the announcements, and I will introduce our speaker, who is Bud Anderson. He lives on South Fidalgo. He's retired after 44 years of working at Shell Refinery as an electrical engineer. He serves on the boards of No More Bombs and Transition Fidalgo and Friends. Bud owns a small electrical contracting company called Washington Electric. He's involved in building many houses in the Anacortes area to provide affordable housing, which I didn't know, that's delightful. And he's a strong supporter of Washington State University scholarship programs and of various environmental organizations, Whidbey Playhouse, Boy Scouts of America, and etc. It's very busy. A lot of really good contributions to our community. He was among 4 Anacortes residents who toured Hanford Nuclear Reservation this summer. Tonight's report will feature the difficulty faced by the government and Hanford's workers in cleaning up the nuclear radiation waste materials. So I'll introduce Bud. Please hold I'll have you come up. Please hold your questions until after the presentation, and then I'll moderate the discussion. Thank you, Bud.
Well, thank you so much, Corrine. She's one of my favorites. I attend as many of the Fidalgo Democrat meetings and have really learned a lot over a few years. When I look around, I see so many old friends and good friends. Will Reichert, I remember he was a Boy Scout when I was over at his dad's house. And when he goes to Eagle Scout, I was the guy that, are you a good Eagle Scout? Yes, I am. Okay, you passed. But his dad was just a splendid man, his dad and mom, and good friends of mine. And it's great to see kids like that grow up in the community, be able to stay in the community and prosper. You're an inspiration. Well, there's a lot of other inspirations here. Rich Bergner, President of Transition Fidalgo and Friends, and I've known each other probably 11 years. I'm a member of their board. And I would invite you, anyone interested in transition programs that's concerned about the environment, talk to Rich or myself after, and we'll get you signed up on our email list. I'm representing No More Bombs tonight. Tracy Powell, sitting in the back, is our inspirational leader and founder of the group a few years ago. We're a small group, but we're gaining a lot of traction. And we'll be sure that we send around a email list. If you want to get on our list, please sign up. We're going to have quarterly meetings throughout the year, and they'll be on topics concerning nuclear energy, nuclear waste, nuclear bombs, and why really the good does not outweigh the bad. The bad outweighs the good. And we should have an objective to eliminate nuclear weapons worldwide. That's what we believe. And if you also believe that, please join us. So tonight's talk centers around 4 people in Anacortes that went over to Hanford and toured the facility. So it's really kind of neat. Hanford was built in the 40s, was a top secret government installation. No one could go in there except if you had clearance. And they made materials for nuclear weapons, and all that is super secret. So, but that's changed a little bit now. They're doing their best to clean that up. And my talk will be centered on, well, they're doing their best, but in reality, it's not enough. And they're not achieving their goals. It's costing a literal fortune. And I think at the end of the program, I'm going to keep this in really plain, simple terms. You'll see that. So Kathleen Flanagan went in June or July, I think, by herself over, there's 3 tours there. There's a historic tour, there's a B reactor tour, and then there's what they call the cleanup tour. Really should be called the mess up tour. The historic tour and the B reactor tour are pretty easy to get into. You pretty much sign up. The cleanup tour is pretty carefully regulated. They do background checks on you, and you're really constrained on what you can do and what you can't do. But it's very interesting, and I have some pictures of that. And then a month after that, Jackie, myself, and Julia Hurt went and did the same 2 tours. So with that, I'm going to take just 2 minutes. This is going to be a different subject, but I'm going to explain to you how nuclear weapons work. 2 minutes. So as you can gather, my talk is going to be very basic, very straightforward. If we had a nuclear physicist here or a chemist, PhD, you know, he could criticize me, but I don't think you guys will, because I'm going to tell you how they work. Because when you understand how they work, you'll then understand what the problem is to get rid of the stuff. So in the 1900s, like early 1900, Albert Einstein put up a formula. Does everybody know what that formula was? E equals mc squared. Wow. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, is really fast. Square it, big number. Now the difficulty you folks are going to have is the same difficulty I have. How do you understand things that are really, really small? And how do you understand things that are really, really big? Well, it's hard, but we'll get there. So if you take just a real small amount of mass and you convert it into energy, and you did that right here, Fidalgo Island would disappear. I mean, that's the scale we're talking about. Okay, so a little bit later in the 30s, scientists discovered, okay, if you have an atom is made of proton, neutron, and then they have little electrons floating around the outside. If you took the biggest atom known to mankind, which was uranium, and you shot a proton into it, under the right conditions, it would split in 2. And when it split in 2, 2 protons zipped away, and then these 2 particles of this atom split in some kind of haphazard fashion into 2 different elements, and it could be random, any 2 elements. Okay, so really smart people thought, wait a minute, if you put a lot of uranium together, and you shot a proton into it, and 2 go, if it hits 2 more, what happens then? Now you've got 4. And if you've got more uranium here, then you've got 8, 16. And that's what happens, and that's the fundamental science for nuclear weapons. Because when that big atom splits apart, the little atoms don't need as much energy to keep them together. They're smaller, they're more efficient. They don't need as much energy. And there's a very, very, very little amount of mass. Insignificant. But when you multiply that by billions and billions, it's tremendous. And the heat energy isn't like an explosion, a chemical explosion, it's heat. So you get an enormous amount of heat really quick. Okay, that's uranium. There's only one other element that does that, and that's plutonium. And plutonium is worse because when you shoot a proton into plutonium, it ejects 3 protons. So now if you have a whole bunch of plutonium, here comes 1 proton, 3, what's the next step? Somebody tell me the next step. 9. What's the next step? 27. What's the next step? 81. So, that was, no, thank you. So you can go from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, which is, you know, it's going to get big. Or you can go 1, 3, 9, 27, 81. It gets big really quick. When you have a nuclear detonation of a uranium bomb, it occurs in 1/1,000,000 of a second. and you get 80 permutations. You shoot one proton, a millionth of a second later, you have 80 permutations doubling, and Fidalgo Island goes away. A plutonium bomb is so much more deadly. In a nanosecond, it explodes. So all nuclear weapons these days, everybody wants plutonium because you can get a bigger bang. You can have a bigger weapon of mass destruction. So with that, I'm just about done with this talk on nuclear physics. Oh, you opened that. That was supposed to be a surprise.
You're surprised.
Please act surprised. Thank you. Doggone it all. Does anybody know what that is? That's a bomb. That bomb is the first weapon of mass destruction used to kill as many people as possible. There's two rather interesting things about this drawing. One is it's accurate. The second one is it's to scale. So this gives you a very good idea of what we're looking at. This is the weapon, weighed 10,000 pounds, that was dropped from the Enola Gay, August 6, 1945, that obliterated Hiroshima, Japan. And in 15 seconds, I'll show you how that works. When you have enough uranium compacted together in one spot, that's called critical mass. You won't get an explosion if you have smaller than critical mass, but you will if you have more than one critical mass. Like you could have 2 or 3 or 4. This had about 1.5 critical masses. So what they did is they took like 2/3 critical mass, 2/3 critical mass. They put them together real quick. Now you got a 1.5. That's enough. It's rather cleverly done. This is a 6-inch artillery barrel. So just take a standard, they just went to the armory in Philadelphia, I think. They got a 6-inch gun. This is the breech of the gun. They cut it off short. They put a whole bunch of really heavy material here because this bullet's coming into this material real fast. So that's just a 6-inch gun. That's all that is. 2/3 of the uranium is right here. That's called the target. These are rings, this big. This measures 6.5 inches. These are rings. That's the target. These are donuts. And there's like 9 donuts there. They had to make them small because if you had a big piece of uranium, you could blow up the lab you're working in, right? So you make small ones and then put them together to make sure you don't get more than a critical mass. So here's all these donuts. Here's a bullet. Here's a slug. Here's the powder. When you shoot the gun, no different than shooting a rifle. Not a bit different. When you shoot a 6-inch artillery, same thing. This uranium comes here, 1,000 feet per second, and the reaction 1, 2, 4, etc. is slow enough that it gets here and is stopped a millionth of a second later. Hiroshima's gone. That quick. Okay. The reason we're all worried about Iran and all this stuff getting nuclear weapons is if you have enriched uranium, now uranium's all over the world, right? Enriching it's tricky. If you have enriched uranium, I mean, I think this room together, in the shop class could build this, right? Get a 6-inch piece of gun, big pieces. I mean, it's not inconceivable to see that people can do this without an enormous amount of scientific effort or talent. That's how uranium bomb works. Plutonium is different, and if you take time to come to our No More Bombs meetings later this next year, you'll see that instead of this mass of 150 pounds, you've got about 15 pounds of plutonium, and it's shaped exactly like this. What you do is you surround it with 6 feet of explosives, and in a very, very tricky, complicated way, that explosion, instead of bursting out, bursts in. I won't explain it tonight, but I will next year. And that shock wave comes in so hard, so fast, it compresses this plutonium. Now think about if these are the parts I struggle with, but if this was steel, think how hard it would be to compress steel. It'd be pretty hard, wouldn't it? Plutonium's more dense, heavier. They compress plutonium to this size. Density is inversely proportional to the square. We've reduced the size, the diameter, half. We've increased the diameter 4 times. This becomes critical and detonates. And this is, you can use a small amount and it gives a huge explosion. So those are the 2 kinds of nuclear weapons. Now with that background, we're going to talk about how we got those materials and what we do with them. And oops, we forgot about the waste. So we'll put the screen down. And Corinne, is it okay if I change the rules just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I don't mind questions as we go, just because if you have a question, it's going to be really tough to think back. But let's, I'll make my answers really short, we'll keep moving. But if you have a question, feel free to interrupt me. It doesn't bother me at all. Okay, lights please. And what's it take to...
What does it take? It's no lag.
Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna go around and just get out of the light here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it's not real convenient, is it, with the speakers? Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I'm gonna hide over here. Okay. Wow. Is it? Let's see, we probably can't move that, can we?
We can move.
Maybe, how's this?
The lectern can, it moves very easily if you want to move the lectern.
Okay, I think I'm okay as long as it... All right. So, in July 1945, they tested the plutonium bomb, and the reason they tested it, it was really, really complicated. The way to get this circular explosion coming in is just enormously complicated, but they successfully tested it. The uranium bomb, they didn't even test it. They were so sure and it was so simple. The first use of it was in the picture. Hopefully the picture will come back.
It will come back.
So probably all of us have seen pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that's Hiroshima, and that bomb was detonated about 2,000 feet above the city, and it annihilated 70,000 people in that time frame, and then another total 200,000 due to burns, radiation sickness, etc. So I'll go on, and I'm sure the pictures will show up.
What happened to the plane?
The what?
The plane that dropped it.
Okay, that's interesting. So the Enola Gay, has anyone seen the Enola Gay? I have. Jackie has. Yeah. It's in the Smithsonian Great Museum. You guys go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C.? So if you go to the one that's outside Washington, D.C., it's called the User
It is
something or other, thank you, Hayes or something. They have the actual Enola Gay. It's a B-29 bomber made in Seattle. Here's what they do. They're flying, they're at 30,000 feet. They drop the bomb. As soon as they drop it, they have 45 seconds. So what they do, they turn a hard turn, not a 180 because that takes more time. 156 degrees until they're on a direct line away from the center. You think about it, you're going here, you do this big swing. As soon as they're going directly away from the bomb, that's 156 degrees. And then they give her full throttle, and they made it out of there. So they witnessed the shock wave of the bomb coming up, and the second shock wave, which was smaller, which was reflecting off the ground and hitting the plane. But they made it out. Then they went back and took pictures. So I'm just going to go on in the presentation. I'm sure the slides will come back. So the next slide I have talks about the total number of nuclear weapons in the world, just for a database. And there's about 15,000. Most of those are the United States and Russia. About 6,000 each. Okay, thank you. This will help. Trust me. Okay, so that's Hiroshima. That could be any city in the country or the world, and that's the result of a nuclear explosion. So these are the 15,000 weapons. Russia, 6,500, the United States, 61, and then the other countries, there's 9 of them: France, China, UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and Korea. Years ago, before SALT, and I think it was Reagan and Gorbachev credit, that number wasn't 16,000, it was 30,000 each. We had 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. 70,000. Wow. But that's so overkill. I mean, if you detonate 1,000 in the US and 1,000 in Russia, I mean, the world just packs it up. It's over, right? The radiation it'll kill everybody. And you can survive if you're in a bomb shelter, but in a day or a week or a month, you'll come up, right? So during the Cold War, you know, they had Greenbrier outside Washington, D.C. Does anybody know what Greenbrier is? It's a secret, huge base dug under the mountain. And the president and Congress was all going to go to Greenbrier. Now, there wasn't room for you guys in this room, but there was room for them. That's okay. They could have lasted a long time. I think it was like 3 months. But you know, sooner or later, they're going to have to come out. I'm not sure which is worse. That's what they had. That was a secret. Secret's out.
Bud,
Ma'am.
what's the difference between retired, stockpiled, and deployed?
Okay. Deployed. Deployed means it's sitting on that missile right there. This is on a submarine, Trident submarine. There's 20 of those tubes. Each one has 8 warheads, multiple independently targeted warheads. MIRV.
And they're located 20 miles west of Seattle.
And I will comment on that. Stockpiled would mean they're in a warehouse ready to go. So when you bring your submarine back, you just load another 240 on and out the submarine goes. And retired would mean they're in storage, because when you make plutonium, for all practical purposes, it never goes away. And when I say never, I mean never. This pound of plutonium will stay inert. It'll stay a pound of plutonium forever. And at the end of my talk, I get into numbers, but it's just forever. So once you make the stuff, you don't need any more. You got it. So when we reduced our inventory, we don't have a need to make plutonium anymore. So Hanford is not operating. So they didn't close Hanford down because they're good people, they're good old boys, or they had a conscience. They closed it down because literally we have no more need for nuclear material. None. So that's, oh boy, and okay. This, I think there's a pointer here, so let me look. Yes.
Yeah.
So here's the little boy, here's some statistics, 10,000 pounds. You saw the drawings, so you know all about this. 15,000 tons of TNT. If you blow up 15,000 tons of TNT, it's the same as what that that weapon did. It only used 1.4% of its fuel, so it's very inefficient. The plutonium bomb, because it's round and big, was called Fat Man. Weighs about the same, 5 feet in diameter. It's plutonium. It was only 13 pounds of fuel, but it was more efficient. The compressing of the plutonium was more efficient. Okay, now let's take a look at Hanford. Every bit of plutonium at the start of the war was produced at Hanford, Washington. Now since then, I think they built a plant, I believe it's Savannah, Georgia. Hanford produced 2/3 of all the plutonium in the United States, overall, 2/3. And, oh boy, and this is Hanford, down here. So Richland, Kennewick, Pasco. This is a huge area, 20 or 30 miles across both directions. State highway right through here. Until recently, it was, you couldn't transit, but you can now, it's open now. All along the river, they put the reactors, and we're going to look at those, because they needed lots of cooling water. So they take huge amounts of water from the Columbia River, which is cold and good water. They end up heating it up pretty well and dump it back in the river. And then these areas are the processing areas where they take the fuel and process it chemically to make plutonium. So we're going on the tour. So Kathleen parks her car, walks in here, you'll note it's a National Historic Park. It's a national park. That's kind of cool. And you hop on a bus, you take about a 45-minute drive, go through a few gates, you look.
Is there a way you could get back around?
Okay, sorry. I'm married, you can tell, right? So get off the bus. This is our group. We go in, this is the B reactor. So the nuclear reactor is actually right in the center. This is the B reactor complex, why it's producing plutonium. So you'll note there's just a ton of buildings all over the place. Here's the reactor building. Most of this is water treating. So you bring in all this water. Now the Columbia River is pretty clean, pretty good water, but you run through demineralizers, deaerators, to get everything out of that water you can so you have pure water. And then you've got a pump row with steam turbines and electric pumps that force huge amounts of water through this because it generates so much heat. You've got to get rid of that heat some way. You go inside the reactor building, and this is about, roughly 40 feet across, 40 feet high, 30 feet deep. This is the reactor, and it's a big mass of graphite blocks, so carbon blocks. It's got 2004 tubes that run through that reactor. And you put the uranium in, and when it's through its reaction, it comes out uranium with just a little bit of plutonium. So that's, I think, a better view. Just like if you're sitting in this audience, it'd be just exactly like this. And here's this huge face. It's like you're in a gymnasium. I mean, you can just look at the scale of the people. And these are water risers. Water risers going here. Water's injected down the tubes. This is the water pipes coming in. It's hard to see the scale, but these are huge water pipes with the water feeding into the reactor. So this is an interesting contraption. This is how they get the fuel into the reactor and how they get it out of the reactor. So every one of those tubes, this is a scale model of those tubes. It's this size, about 1 3/4 inches. So what they do is they line up 8 dummy slugs, and this is inert material that won't pass radiation, and they stuff it in that reactor tube, 8 of them. Then they take, and again, this is a scale model, this is aluminum cladding over uranium. You take 32 of these, and you put that in a tube. Then you take 8 more of these, and the reason you do that is the radiation that's in here, you don't want it coming out the ends. They take 8 more of this. Then they leave those in the reactor about a month or 2. And after it's been in there a month or 2, they say, okay, this is uranium. It took a neutron, and some of the material converts to plutonium. Some of it, about 1%. So when it's time to change the reactor, they stuff some more dummy tubes in it. And out the back end of the reactor, these things fall out into a big basin of water. Only this time, it comes out screaming hot radioactive. And it's screaming hot because it's got plutonium in it. And the plutonium will never go away. Plutonium, or any other element, radioactive element, goes away in what they call half-life. Half-life is the time it takes to go from your intensity of your existing radiation to half. For plutonium, it's 24,000 years. So let's see, my religious friends say, Jesus died 2,000 years ago. Okay, that's 2,000 years. 24,000 years to get to half strength. And then another 24,000 years to get to quarter strength. It takes at least 12 cycles before you get to a low level. So in all practical purposes, it's never not hot radioactive. That's how they load it. At the end of this, they just stuff those elements in. They've got a mechanical device to help push them in. They line these tubes up in whatever configuration they want, and they push the uranium in. So we're walking around and I see these little signs. Okay, if I'm working there, I'm paying attention to the sign. I gave this talk a month ago to a different group, and what I told people then is, if I'm late and I'm coming to this meeting, I might drive 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, right? I mean, we all do it occasionally, whether it's accidental or on purpose. Well, when I read these signs, you don't do it occasionally. You don't look into the end of that tube, just real quick. You don't do anything because you're not fast enough. A lot of other signs I thought they were interesting. This is a model of the reactor. So this would be the face of the reactor. Remember how huge it was. These would be the tubes, like the model I have. And these are the elements that go in. The elements stay in about a month, then they come out with about 1% plutonium. You have to have a continuous flow of water. So at work, let's see, 7 feet per second water was a fast flow water rate. They do 30 feet per second of water in these tubes. In other words, they just force the water in really hard because so much heat is generated that if they don't do that, that reactor will melt. And then there's real problems, right? Just look at Fukushima, look at Chernobyl. You have real problems when they melt. This is the slug. That's the tube, and you've seen my scale models of those. Sorry. I'll let you there. Okay, I'll try. Remind me. So that's my wife, Jackie, sitting in Fermi's chair. So Enrico Fermi, this is no kidding, sat in that chair. That is the control room for the entire B reactor. Well, there's a lot of other stuff, but I mean, that's where he sat and controlled the B reactor. Well, as soon as she got up, I had to sit down. So now I'm the big cheese. I'm controlling the reactor. There are 9 control rods filled with boron that go in and out of the reactor to regulate it. So when the neutron flux gets high, 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 the reactor's getting hot, ooh, we're gonna melt. You push these rods into the reactor. We need to get the reaction up to make a lot of plutonium, you pull them out. So that's how you control the reactor. And that's all the control you had as far as on-off. That's a control board, it's a temperature board. You monitor the temperature going in and out of every one of those tubes, and it's critical. If one got hot, you had to shut the reactor down. I don't know if anybody can see that sign right there. Don't bump those things, because if you bump it and shut the reactor down, you get a demerit. That's behind the control board. Look at all those devices. Certainly not one of them would ever go wrong, would they? You never need any maintenance on those. Actually, the reactor worked rather well. I have to give them credit. It's unbelievable. It worked really well. I like this. This is right behind the control room. Here's a desk where they did engineering, and if you look closely, there's slide rules. So they built this with slide rules. When I went to Washington State University as a freshman, 1962, I took a 1-credit class on how to use a slide rule. That changed the next year. So the tubes are here. The front of the reactor's here. These long tubes are here. When it's time to push them through, they just pushed them through. And they plopped in this great big swimming pool. And they plopped in the swimming pool because the water contained the radiation. So here come all these slugs. Every one of them deadly. Every one. Every one contaminated with plutonium that'll never go away. But when they're underwater, you're shielded from the radiation. So what they did is all these slugs come down, they put them in casks, weighed them, and moved them for storage. Because you wanted to keep that stuff for probably a couple months in there. In addition to the plutonium, there's all this other radiation. Some of it short-lived. You wanted to get the radiation levels down low. So they kept them in here a couple months, except when they felt like they needed more stuff, and they took them out early. We'll talk about that. So this is actually behind the reactor. You can see that as a guest. Sweetie, can you move over there? Okay. That's the pool. These are all the slugs. You get about 240 in these things, and then you transfer them to a train car. And this is actually the train, the car, and there's 3 casks here, and you put a lot of that stuff in here in lead boxes and then surrounded by water. And you move them to chemical processing. The chemical processing is done in a different area. They originally built 3 reactors and had 3 of these huge chemical processing plants. T plant, U plant, and a B plant over here off the drawing. Later in the history of nuclear weapons, they built what's called redox, which was a big plant down here, and then the biggest of all, Purex, that made the vast majority of our nuclear material. Huge plant over here. Oh, and I'll point out a few other things. So when they had this plant, when they had liquid waste, they just pumped it to the tanks. Or, if you see these things that say burial ground, burial ground, burial ground, if you had radioactive waste that you didn't think was too bad, you just dumped it on the ground. We'll look at that in a minute. So this is T-plant. It's called canyon because they resemble Queen Mary's, resemble canyons. This is an underground railroad tunnel. You saw the train. It brings this stuff in. This is all behind 6 feet of concrete walls because if you come in direct line with plutonium, you'll die. And then there's 40 cells here in rooms where they chemically process, where they basically dissolve this in nitric acid, put a batch of that stuff in a big vat. They change the valent state to +4, and they precipitate out the plutonium. And then they change the valent state, and they precipitate it out again, only it goes out as a solution. They do that over and over, just a precipitation process, and at the end they get plutonium. So let's look at the quantities. It's 3 metric tons goes in, 6,600 pounds. About 300 gallons comes out. They transfer it to this building, 300 gallons, and it's another precipitation process. 8 gallons comes out here. So the point of that story is you have a huge amount going in, very little coming out, everything else is waste, and that waste is pumped on the ground, it's pumped in wells, it's put in barrels and buried. Where the high-level waste and the bad stuff was done is pumped into tanks. So there's another view of the canyon, a side view. These are all the process cells where the process equipment is. These are the operating galleries, so operating gallery, electrical one, piping one. And all the process piping was done here behind thick concrete walls. So when you move materials, they're always behind thick concrete because otherwise you'd be irradiated. The crane operator actually sat here behind the shielding in a cab, hermetically sealed, and he looks through with periscopes and operates the crane because if something would go wrong, they'd have to change out equipment. And he would do that remotely. So here comes our train. Here's the material that goes through all these chemical processing. Leaves go to this building. So if I took this and I put it in nitric acid, what would happen? Okay, you dissolve it, you get this big pool of muck. You'd probably also get a lot of fumes, wouldn't you? So all those fumes, and they knew this, so all these air intakes here, they go all through all the process areas, they come through here, they got these huge fans, and then they blow it out of stack. Okay. So when you have plutonium dust, never goes away, you blow it out the stack, but what you say is, the Earth's big, there's a lot of air, it'll dilute it, and it does. However, if you have a little speck of it and you ingest it, it will preferentially go to your vital glands, preferentially. The body doesn't extract it. So if you happen to be downwind of this, like Spokane, good luck. I hope the particle doesn't reach you. I find it interesting, but another side view of the canyons, 60, I think it was 66 feet across, 77 feet high, 280 feet long. So, football field's 300 feet. It's like 3 football fields. I mean, these are huge things. That's a good picture inside. Every one of these is a process. This is where the piping is, the hot piping. Then the crane operator is actually in this channel. The crane's here, and he operates from that crane. That's a view of the railroad tunnel. They're trying to get equipment out and store it, so they're bringing out this piece of equipment. This is radioactive and storing it some way, somehow. It's a fuzzy photograph, but it's the best one I could find. These are the operators. They look through periscopes. You can't look directly at it. So everything is through periscopes and mirrors. This is a block and tackle, and they're working on this device in the cell. Okay, so that's kind of like the first part of my talk. That's the intended consequences. We want to make plutonium because we want to make bombs. And that was the intent, and that's what happened, and we did, and we were very successful at it. What the unintended consequences are, what about these people? On my first tour, which is 2 years ago, they sent out this book. And actually, this is a really good book because it kind of hits these different topics. This picture came out of this book. And what the book points out is there's a lot of ways where this bad stuff can affect these people. The possible path for that is release into the ground, into the groundwater, or release into the air, which animals would eat, that people would eat, or particles, you could breathe them, or release to crops that you eat or fish to eat. And the book talks about that that's the danger of doing that. This is from Washington State University, 2013, and it talks about, here's nuclear material, it's leaking into the ground, they put it in some wells, here's underground tanks, this is just when it's dumped on the ground, that's under the reactors. None of this is cleaned up. Essentially, none of this is cleaned up. The threat becomes if this permeates the soil and it's about 200 feet and gets down to the groundwater, then there's a quick and direct path to the Columbia River. So that's the real threat. So the ways they dispose of material, high-level waste they put in tanks, but they built trenches and just dumped it in trenches, ponds, caverns, dumped it in boxes. This is like a septic tank and just distribute it to the soil. This is one of my favorites. This is the tank farm. So there's 177 tanks. These vary between 500,000 gallons and 1 million gallons. And they're essentially all full with highly reactive radiation products. And it's not like one product. It's not plutonium or uranium. It's a mix match. When these elements break apart, you got strontium, cadmium, you got just iodine, you got all these things. And these tanks are full. They're all underground with about 8 feet of soil on top of them. So I do have a friend that says the outside of the tanks are fairly well protected because they have cathodic protection, which is a way you can protect the outside of the tanks. I have read about that. But the inside of this tank has got all this nitric acid, all these base materials, all the precipitation materials. It's just got, basically scores of chemicals. And not one thing's in one tank. So you got this goo in every tank. And a lot of the tanks are leaking. They're beginning to leak through the bottom. So it's a question of time between when all this material starts going down into the soil and gets into the groundwater. So every tank at Hanford is like this. It's buried in the ground. Now, what I worry about personally is sooner or later this is going to corrode from internal corrosion. And with the weight of the soil and the tank lid, those tank lids are going to begin to collapse. So I think 10 or 20 years from now, you're going to read about in the paper, it'll be, what a disaster. We've just lost tank number 6, whatever, and its roof caved in and all kinds of radiation went out the top. That is a very realistic possibility. So here's all the tanks. These are the double wall tanks. They don't have very many, but they have a few. Double wall tanks are good because if you leak through one shell, you at least have some time to think about what are you going to do, like try to pump it out and pump it someplace else. But most of them are 25-year lifespan single wall tanks, and probably about half of them have failed and they're leaking into the ground. In the trenches that I mentioned that they just poured stuff into, this is trench length by burial ground in miles, total of 45 miles of trenches. So here's the different trench numbers. Here's how many miles those trenches are that are filled with radioactive stuff. Uranium inventory by burial ground, this one's got a huge amount and then they're spread over others. And here's the bad one though, again, because plutonium just doesn't go away. Here's the different waste areas where plutonium is just mixed with other components and dumped on the ground. So if you went to that waste area, 218W2, you'd have 130 kilograms of plutonium spread across the ground. Every United States nuclear submarine reactor, when it needs to be refueled, what they do is they cut the submarine out, the reactor out, and they take it to Hanford and they stick it on a concrete pad. So when you're on the tour, the cleanup tour, you see this. I mean, this is historic. We saw this. Now, when we were there, there was probably 3 or 4 times. Do you remember that, Kathleen? It's a huge, this thing, I don't know how long it is, a long way, filled. These are submarine reactors. The rectangle ones are off surface ships, cruisers, destroyers, whatever surface ship you have.
One of these.
Pardon?
One of these.
Well, one for each vessel, yeah, like, that would be one submarine. That,
Those are ones.
yeah, yes, sir, right, they don't package them together. Thank you. That's right, that one there is probably a cruiser or something.
There's only one cruiser built with no kind of stuff.
Okay, well then I'll change it up. Aircraft carriers, because there's lots of those. Yeah, thank you. I didn't know that, by the way, one cruiser. Okay, so aircraft carrier, that's the reactor. That's what you got to do, because you can't work on them. It's just too dangerous.
How often do they need to be replaced?
You know, I don't know that. I don't know that. I'm going to guess 20 years, but I don't know that. I think someone here knows what they're talking about. Did you work in that field, sir?
Yes, sir.
And is it 20 years?
About 20 years.
Thank you. Okay, now I hate to do this. Raise your hand if you guys are not following me or you want me to be quiet, but you kind of almost have to read this because this is pretty cool. And I'm almost at the end, by the way. 55 million gallons of Hanford's high-level radioactive waste containing 177 underground tanks. A third have leaked. All are beyond their design lives. 28 tanks are double shell. At least 1 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste has leaked into the soil. The leaked waste is a huge cleanup challenge. Tanks are able to accommodate between 500 to 1 million gallons buried. In addition to the waste inside the tanks, waste was also deliberately discharged to the soil. An estimated 120 million gallons of waste from Hanford tanks were directly ejected into the soil in this manner. The tanks hold waste created during the presence of extracted plutonium from spent fuel and contain both radioactive and chemical waste. So those are points to note. And this is my last one I'm going to go over. The only plan with dealing for Hanford tank waste is to immobilize the waste in glass through a process called vitrification. The waste treatment plant is being built for that purpose. So part of the cleanup tour, we saw the vitrification plant, and it is a huge plant. It's made up of, I think, 5 or 6 gigantic, enormous buildings. The biggest of all is the high-level waste plant. There's like a pre-treatment plant, a separation plant, a low-level plant, and a high-level plant. These plants are horribly behind schedule, and not a little bit, horribly. Oh, by the way, I've got copies of most of these slides. I was going to pass it out, but I think it'll be better if you come up afterwards. Most of these I have copies of, but feel free to take pictures. But I just got too much on my mind to think that through. Anyway, moving on. Oh, this is my last slide. But I want to spend just a little bit of time here. Now, these are gross simplifications. Waste volume. When you mine uranium, if I go to Utah and I mine uranium, I dig up a ton of uranium. 140, let's say I dig up 140 tons of uranium. 1 ton of that is U-235, which is the fissionable material you want. 139 tons is waste. So just round numbers, 1 over 400, that should have been 140. Oh, wait a minute, okay. So so you want this for your bomb, but you get mostly this, and that's waste. Then you take this, which just has a very small amount of plutonium. Remember, we started 800 gallons, the 3 short tons, the 6,600 pounds. Then we got to 300 gallons, and we got to 8 gallons. So you go from 800 gallons to get 8 gallons of plutonium. That's about 1/100th. So actually, my calculation's wrong. That should have been 1 over 140. So this is an exaggeration. So this number probably is more like 1 in 10,000. In other words, for every, I'll correct that, I'm so sorry. For every 1 pound of stuff you want, you get 10,000 pounds of garbage. And that garbage, in some cases, is just dumped in the ground. The high-level waste, they did try to put it in tanks, and it's still there, leaking. So the point of this top part of the slide is you get what you want, you get the plutonium, but you get enormous quantities of waste. That's the message I'm trying to get across. So now let's look what the United States government tells us, right? We're all part of the government. I pay my taxes, we're all part of the government. Cost and schedule. This should have been year. In 2002, they started to build this plutonium finishing plant. And by the way, 14,000 people work at Hanford. Their budget is between $2.5 and $3 billion a year. 14,000 people work at Hanford. Budget $2.5 to $3 billion a year. In 2002, according to USA Today, and I've got a copy right here for you if you'd like, they said, well, we're going to build this plutonium finishing plant. We'll be through in 2011. No worries. It's expensive. It's going to cost $4 billion. And so the President of the United States and Congress says, okay, let's do it. We'll spend $4 billion, and by 2011, we'll have her all cleaned up, and we're happy, and we would be. Okay, 10 years later, 2012, they say, no, we can't quite get done. We'll be done in 2019, and by the way, the cost has tripled. Okay, no harm, no foul. $12 billion, we'll do it. Take one of these if you want. This is 2010. This is from the Department of Energy. It talks about how wonderful this project is coming along. This is 2010. It's 53% complete. That's really good. By 2013, the design will be complete. By 2016, we'll start up. By 2019, we'll be fully operational. That's what the President's told, and Congress is told, and we're told. Now let's enter the real world. Hanford, DOE. Things aren't going well. The governor knows it, the senators know it, everybody knows it. So they push the government hard. And in 2016, They come to an agreement and they say, okay, we're going to issue reports every year on the status of the job, the construction, how we're doing. So in 2016, they say, well, we'll finish the job in 2066, and it'll cost between $103 billion and $107 billion. And in that case, it'll take to 2066. So that's the official agreement with the state of Oregon, state of Washington, congressman. That's what they said. Now, we were on the tour. We saw the building. Building isn't finished. It isn't close to being finished. It's a shell. They have 5 or 6 of these big cranes around. Now, when we were there, I have to admit, we were there at 12:30. Of the 3,000 people there, I never saw one person working. I never saw one crane move. I didn't see anybody working. When I've worked on big jobs, they stagger shifts, right? You don't have 3,000 people come. You bring in 1,000. You stagger your lunch. I never saw one person working. And there's a reason for that. This job has been started and stopped 4 times. And it stopped because they don't know what they're doing. And they admit it. We don't know what we're doing. We better stop the job. It's been started and stopped 4 times. The separation plant is currently on hold because they don't know what to do. So, if these numbers didn't get your attention, these next one will. They made an agreement, okay, we're going to issue reports every year. Nope. We're just not ready. It'll take us at least 3 years to do a report. So, the state agreed it'll be 3 years. So, in 19, they issued the annual report. And it said they'll finish the job between 2079 and 2102. The best cost estimate is $323 billion, finished in 79. Worst case, $677 billion, finished in 2102. So I would ask you, I mean, I worked on tons of projects over my career. If I was over 10%, I got it. How can you go from this number and this number to this? And what I speculate, when it's 2022, what in the world are these numbers going to be? With that, I will conclude my talk, but I thank you so much for your attention. Yes?
Who's measuring how much of this material is actually getting? Oh, we have a microphone so people can ask questions.
Okay, I think, Corinne, did you want to step in and help me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'd like to try it out a different way. Have you come up and say your questions into this mic.
If we could, unless we need to see the slides, we could probably turn the lights on.
Yeah.
Okay?
Check. That's all.
And everybody can hear the question. So, was it you, Maureen? Oh, it's you. Oh, okay. And state your name so we can all get to know you.
My name's Savannah, and I just want to know what kind of monitoring is going on? What kind of monitoring is going on in terms of what is getting back on the river, what is getting into the groundwater of the surrounding areas? I want to know what kind of monitoring is being done.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know the answer to that, but I will say there's extensive monitoring. I think the safety precautions and the monitoring is extensive. Now, unfortunately, I can't answer that. I mean, I don't know. But I've talked to probably over 10 people that either are currently working there or have worked there. And actually, I'll share a story with an engineer that's currently employed there. And like, I hope he wasn't exaggerating. he said like there'll be a fence here and he's authorized to work in this area, but if he has to work in that area, he has to go through 2 weeks of safety training on contamination, decontamination, blah, blah, blah. So I have it, and it's not like it's not being monitored. I think it's being monitored. I'll tell you what worries me about this is I say just be honest and be truthful. And I don't think the government is being forthcoming. Not forthcoming at all. And I think this slide shows that.
I'm wondering if food sources are being monitored at all.
What's that again?
Food sources, fish, crops.
That is a tough one. I can't answer it. I have opinions on that. My opinions are not good. If you look at the Spokane down, oh boy, I tell you what, I am going to hand out this one thing. Thank you for pointing that out. How many in this room have heard of the Green Run? Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what the Green Run is. You won't believe me. You'll think I'm exaggerating. But for anybody that's interested, Vanna White will give out a copy of this. When you get home, Google the Green Run. Here's what happened. December 2nd, 1949.
If you want one, just raise your hand.
The U.S., well, wait until I finish. There might be more hands raised. The U.S. said, gosh, Russia just exploded an atomic bomb. We're so disappointed. So we have to get a bunch of instruments calibrated so that when this radioactivity comes over the United States, we can analyze and decide how efficient their bomb is, what the materials are. So what they did on December 2nd, they bypassed the filtration equipment and they intentionally blurped out a huge amount of radioactivity. That was called the Green Run. And then they measured it. Unfortunately, though that would have been bad enough, unfortunately they blurped out twice as much as they had originally planned to. All that radiation went all across Washington, didn't tell anybody about it, denied by the government until 1979 when the Freedom of Information Act, some documents came forward. The government today will not confirm or deny that. Everybody knows it's true. So how can a person, if you're the president or Congress, or if you're the Department of Energy, or if you're in the military, how can a person spread major quantities of radioactivity across parts of the United States? How can you do that? And not tell anybody. People in Spokane weren't told that. If you lived in Othello, you weren't told that. But you run a good chance of getting cancer later. That's a true story. So, Vanna, anyone that wants to read about it. But the other way to independently check it, when you get home, just Google Green Run. Sir.
Thank you.
And other people who have a question, you can just line up behind those lines if you like. And say your name, sir.
Name is Glenn Streep. And I've read something about France and how they're treating their atomic waste. Is there any information that you've gotten that indicates how maybe our atomic waste could be treated?
Okay, thank you. Good question, and I think I can partially answer that. I don't know anything about France. I mean, all these countries have the same issue. It's hard enough to find out what's going on here. The strategy that the United States is doing, and I agree with it, is to vitrify the waste. And vitrification means you essentially make glass out of it. So if I had a gallon of gooey waste, and I pour a bunch of silica sand in it and a few other chemicals, and I put it in, I think it's a calciner or something, and you heat it up to 2200 degrees, it forms glass. And then this glass can be put in containers. And the containers can be put in a long-term nuclear storage facility. Right now, There is one low-level waste facility, low-level, and that's in Carlsbad, New Mexico. And they've got problems down there, but they do have one. That only takes military waste. Yucca Mountain was supposed to be the spot of choice to put our high-level waste, but thanks to Harry Reid and others, nope, they're not accepting any. There's no spot in the United States to accept any nuclear waste, so it just sits where it is. Every nuclear plant, I think there's 96 of them in the US, they take their spent fuel and they put them in a pool of water. By the way, you better keep water in that pool, because there's no place to ship it. Nobody will take it. So the waste is just accumulating because nobody thought through the process. We're going to make all this bomb stuff, but what are we going to do with the waste? Nobody thought through successfully how to do that, even today, because it didn't happen. So to answer your question, I don't know about France. There's no high-level nuclear waste repository, and as long as Harry Reid's in charge of the Senate, there won't be in Nevada. Yes.
Can you go to the
What's the
mic?
difference between a hydrogen bomb and a fission bomb?
Okay, I can do that. What's the difference between a hydrogen bomb and a fission bomb? Okay, so a fission bomb is that, right? Fission bomb, fissioning. A fusion bomb puts things together. So if you, okay, this is like the first generation. This is fission weapons, both uranium and plutonium, it's fission. What they do in a H-bomb, and if you take time and come to our No More Bombs meeting, we'll show you in detail. They take Fat Man, picture Fat Man, picture a cylinder below it, and they put material of lithium deuteride, plutonium, and other materials, uranium, in a tube. And then the X-rays, when this goes off, it emits just an enormous amount of X-rays, goes into a foam surrounding this material. The foam heats up to god-awful degrees, expands and compresses the lithium deuteride, and it fuses, and that's a fusion reaction. That's a thermonuclear weapon. So we'll talk about that for 10 seconds. Fat Man, you can make Fat Man bigger by building a bigger bomb, but all of a sudden now you've got 100,000 pounds of this huge thing, right? It's not very practical. It's hard to take a plane and go drop it on people. The plane can't get off the ground. But a thermonuclear weapon, you just take a small explosion, you can make this secondary as big as you want. How big do you want one? It's standard to have a 500 kiloton explosion up here in this round thing, 500 kilotons. Hiroshima is 15 kilotons. Standard weapon is 500 kilotons. So you take that 500 kilotons, you can make that a megaton, 10 megatons, as big as you want. It's just how much material you have below it, because that X-ray will compress as big as quantity as you want. The United States detonated a 15 megaton bomb. I think it was Ivy Mike. That's the biggest one. Russia designed 100 megaton, and then somebody got to them. They said, okay, we'll scale back. Their biggest detonation was 50 megatons. 50 megatons. 50 million pounds of TNT. That's the answer to your question. Ago, and a good friend, I had him critique it, and he said, well, make sure the audience knows where you're going. So here's where I'm going. Hanford is a good...
Yes.
Developing atomic bombs is a horrible thing. We should never have done it. But once you've crossed that threshold, that's the real world. So Hanford is a good thing. I'm all for Hanford. We don't need to be spending $3 billion a year at Hanford. We need to spend $30 billion, $300 billion every year. We need to give every major university in the United States $100 million, $200 million. Do research, think out of the box. What can we do to clean up this mess? What can we do to change highly radioactive material into something that's inert? That's what I think we should do. We have no time. It's already past due. We need to spend so darn much money. And the only way out that I see, Warren, is that we do that. So, we have 2 senators from Washington, Patty Murray, Maria Cantwell, we have a governor. If you rub shoulders with these people, remind them that you as a constituent think this is a serious problem, and please help us, help the world. Thank you. Sir.
You left the mic out.
That's okay. My name is Todd Legacy. I was a nuclear mechanic on submarines in the United States Navy. So I really appreciate and enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that you didn't factor in at the end or talk about as far as cleanup goes is that the cleanup is being done by private contractors. And private contractors are making money off of all of that. And they make more money when they delay. And so I think that what we didn't talk about is that the cleanup actually needs to be done by the United States government. It needs to be taken over, and the government needs to form an entity and do that. Maybe they need to bring the nuclear navy in or whatever they need to do, but it needs to be done by government employees, not private contracted out. And I think that that is going to be the real fix to this. And so I would say not just throw money at it, but restore it back to government employees would be a big one. So, and then I would also just say,
by the way, I happen to agree with that, and I'm going to comment on that when you're through with your second question.
Thank you. I guess it's a little more of a comment. So it's about waste, right? The big problem with nuclear power is about waste. One, when you mine it, you talked about the uranium-235 versus uranium-238. Yep. And what, as you mentioned there, it's 1 to 140. So a lot of what happens is the mining tailings just get left at the uranium mine, and then the water, the rainwater actually washes that into the rivers. So that's a whole nother issue that isn't even addressed as part of the Hanford cleanup. And then a gentleman asked about vitrification. The United States hasn't really done a good job of actually being able to deal with its waste. Vitrification like they do in France, we're not doing a good job. The difference they do in France versus what we're looking at in Hanford is in France they're dealing with a consolidated waste that comes out of a nuclear reactor, right? We're dealing with a toxic Superfund site at Hanford. And so there are 2 different issues, right? How to deal with waste that comes out of a reactor, you can vitrify it, it's contained, versus the uncontained mess at Hanford. So those are like the 3 different ways or levels of dealing with waste. That's the comment I would have. So.
Thank you, sir. I actually enjoyed all the comments. If I could just comment a little bit let's see, what was your first point?
Private contractors.
Thank you. Gosh, I didn't want to forget that. That's true. And in Russia, actually, let's talk about nuclear accidents. 3 Mile Island, that actually was kind of a minor accident, but it was close to population, so people got nervous. It spewed a little bit of radiation. Fukushima is a big deal. Holy cow. There were 6 General Electric breeder, boiling water reactors, and 3 of them got flooded. 3 were shut down, 3 of them were active, and they blew 3 of them up. And they blew 3 of them up because, remember we talked about water and how important water was? So what happened at Fukushima, they designed the berms to protect the seawater to 35 feet. Well, when they had the I've heard numbers between 8.9 and 9.2 magnitude earthquake out in the ocean, they had a 45-foot wave came in. And it went right over that berm, flooded the plants, and what it did, it knocked out all the cooling water pumps in the main system and the backup systems. They did have a battery system that worked for about a day, and then 3 reactors blew up. And they blew up because the core, just like in what we showed you, where Kathleen was standing, and that reactor didn't have cooling water, so it gets hot and it melts. When it gets over 2,500 degrees, it melts. And all that radioactive material goes to the bottom of the vessel, And if it's a steel, in the case of Fukushima, it's a steel vessel, no problem, it goes right through it. And the concrete barrier, they don't know how badly damaged that is or fractured. And when you have this element, this is a zirconium cladding. When you get it really, really hot in water, zirconium goes to zirconium oxide. That leaves H2O, you've taken the O out, you get H left. That leaves hydrogen. So hydrogen accumulates in these vessels and they blow up. And they blew 3 of them up. Blew them up. If you look at those buildings, top third of the building's gone. And there's a big pile of radiation. And that's another whole story. Good God, that's right next to the ocean. They're dumping radioactive waste in the ocean right now. Okay, and that was a real bad one. The worst of the worst. Nobody will ever top this. Russia did it again, boys. Holy cow, Chernobyl. Actually, there was a program on that tonight I was watching. I had to leave because I had to do this talk, but that's really bad. They spread massive amount of radiation all over Russia, all over the world. The documentary tonight talked about it's in food, it's in the animals. Reindeer in Sweden, they're radioactive. I mean, it's really bad. Cancers, a lot of people died. What they did, and that's why I appreciate your comment, they brought in the Army. So what they did is they took helicopter pilots, and here's the reactor, the big hole in the ground, and they took those boys and they flew them over and they dropped boron and cadmium and sand, trying to cover everything up. Well, you better train some new pilots because they're gone.
They're all down. Yeah,
They're
all
gone.
those helicopter pilots died
They're gone.
after a day.
They're gone.
Which is that is after a day. They died after a day. That's how much radiation they were exposed to.
Then they bring in the Army, and everybody knows it's hazardous, so they give them a little dust mask, right? Now this is no kidding. So here's the top of the building. This is no kidding. Oh, God. So it's a big building, and there's water and sludge and radioactive crap all over it. So they give them dust masks, and they put a coverall on them, and everybody gets 70 seconds. So they blow a horn, and this is on TV. I hope you guys, it's on the History Channel. Okay, they blow the horn, so they all go out there with their brooms and shovels, and they're scooping this stuff into this radioactive pit that, you know, if you put your head in, you're going to be dead. So they're just throwing all this stuff in the pit. So in 70 seconds, the alarm goes, and everybody runs out of there as fast as they can because they don't want to die. Well, 30% of them died right away. And then they blow the horn again, and another team of 20 runs out on the roof, starts shoveling like crazy. That's on TV. It was on TV tonight. Our channel's 286, the History Channel. If you get a chance, it's called Chernobyl. If you get a chance, please see it. They explain it much better than I have.
They showed us that in nuke school.
Thank you.
To teach us, and it's interesting. At the end, they showed one of the generals handing a check. These were like privates in the Russian army who had to go out there, and one of their tasks was to throw like 90 kilogram, which is like 180-pound blocks. They had to throw 2 of them into the hole that was the explosion, right? It wasn't a normal hole in the roof. And then the general hands them a check at the end and says, I hope you live long and become a general. That's actually what he said.
And then the third extension of that, they put, because this thing is melting and going down, they were worried it'd get into the ground, and then that's if you don't contain it, it's a super disaster. So they sent miners working just under the radioactivity to dig mines and then filled it full of concrete. And of course, those guys are history. Anyway, thank you. I appreciated that.
Did you know that there was another nuclear accident in Idaho? Excuse me, in Idaho?
No.
Yeah, the Army actually had a reactor in, they called it INEL, Idaho National Engineering Laboratory. And it's out just west of Idaho Falls. And where ARCO is, which is one of the first city that was powered by nuclear power, and that's where they had a bunch of reactors out in the desert. And they had a accident out there, and interestingly, one of the soldiers that died in that is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and his grave is so radioactive you can't go by it. So,
and
just
that's true.
interesting.
Todd, when was that? And would you tell us your full name again?
Oh, Todd Lagasty. I'm the Whatcom Vice Chair for the 40th Legislative District
cool.
Democrats, and I was a machinist mate first class nuclear on the USS Maine, which was out of Kings Bay, Georgia, submarines.
And when was that accident in Idaho?
Maybe the 50s, I think.
Okay, so let me talk, and I want to get your name and number two, because anybody that's associated with it, so I know a guy in Anacortes, and I went to his house and interviewed him last week. So I won't tell you who it is, but he worked at Hanford, and he told me he had a personal list of things that he's worried about, and I didn't even cover those things. But he's worried about the waste encapsulation storage. You know, if the water ever drains out of those pumps, we're going to have a catastrophic disaster, right? So anyway, the point of his story is there's a lot of concerns, but the bureaucracy is so big, and people aren't really, he doesn't feel like he was ever heard. Oh, and I will tell you one other story. So I have a good friend from college who's working there at Hanford. And he doesn't want his name mentioned, but he's making so much money. And I asked him, well, you know, are you doing any good? Yeah, he thinks he's doing good. But he's working on this waste issue. But he says, I mean, it's unbelievable. It just, the waste is so terrific. You know, he's getting well into the six-digit figures, and he hardly works because everything is so permitted, and you have to check and recycle and write reports. It's the way it is.
Well, there's some good to that too, though, right? Because
Yeah, you can't.
You're protecting the workers, you're limiting exposure, you're preventing contamination spread. So, I mean, there are important parts of that. It's a slow process to actually, you know, permit people to go in and then permit people to come out and then check them and all of that.
Okay, so another 30-second on Chernobyl with this big pit and everything. What they did is they built a huge, it looked like a Zeppelin hangar, and they built it on skids. And then they skid this huge, humongous thing over this reactor, and it's big. And that's the way they're trying to contain it. And then they're trying to disassemble it because they have everything sealed up now, and they've got these two cranes, and they're trying to take it apart piece by piece remotely. That's what Russia's doing at Chernobyl. Okay, any other questions?
Don't forget the Bangor Trident base, 20 miles west of Seattle, the largest concentration of deployed nuclear weapons in the U.S.
Thank you. Actually, let me finish on that one because that's a really good one.
Wait, Jim Byron has one.
Oh, okay.
Okay, my name is Jim Byron from Mount Vernon. The thing that everybody is worried about now has to do with fossil fuel and using fossil fuel to make electricity. And the argument that you hear always is that we need to expand our nuclear power in order to make enough electricity so that we can get away from using fossil fuel. What is your idea on how we need to go forward?
Sure.
With regard to balancing all of that?
Thank you. Actually, I was asked that question a couple months ago, and I really thought about, well, what about it? So Tracy, now don't get mad at me, Tracy. Here's my answer. Nuclear-powered reactors generate an enormous amount of electricity. Enormous. I think 1,200 megawatts, one reactor. Each Chernobyl reactor generates 1,200 megawatts. That feeds a huge city, and there's 4 of them. So that's the answer. when we solve the waste issue. So when you or anybody else can come up to me and say you have a technical way to manage the waste, then I say go ahead and build them. Until you can manage the waste, you have no business building a nuclear reactor, period. And yes, environment's a horrible issue. There's another answer, conservation. When I was a kid, I had a car, big old 56 Buick, 10 miles to the gallon. No, we should all have cars 30, 40, 50 miles to the gallon, 100 miles to the gallon. Pickup trucks should be used when you need pickup trucks, not just as a commute vehicle. I worked out at Shell, and a third of the vehicles out there were big old pickup trucks because the boys were big old boys. Baloney. Drive a little teeny car and be happy. I think, sir.
I just had a comment that I read
Oh, yeah, the Bangor thing.
a while ago, that they were going to open like a theme park in Chernobyl.
I saw where the animals were all radioactive, but they're still
Yeah,
multiplying and
I
living
saw
there.
it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to end it after this. I got a question for you. We'll see if anybody answers it, including our nuclear submarine man. If there's a nuclear war with Russia, tell me the top 3 targets that Russia has targeted. I will tell you well, I'm not going to tell you anyone. The top 3. Does anybody think they know the top 3 targets in the United States?
They're all in Puget Sound. DC.
Who said that?
Yeah, DC.
That's number 1. That's number 1. Washington, D.C.
Mexico.
They'll take a MIRVed submarine, because if it's from Russia, it's going to take 30 minutes to get over. If it's out in the Atlantic 500 miles, it's going to take 6-7 minutes. They'll take a MIRV submarine with 10 or 12 nuclear missiles. They'll shoot one of these at Russia. Washington, D.C., the entire area will not exist anymore. It's gone. It'll be just flat rubble like you saw in that picture. Gone. I think they're going to sneak out into a safe bunker. Nope. You'll never make it out of town. That's number 1.
Mar-a-Lago.
All right, now that's the popular choice. I got it.
Seattle.
New York City.
Well, no, that's probably a top 10, but that's not 2. Does anybody know 2? No?
Banger.
Who said that?
Banger.
Number 2,
China Mountain.
Banger.
Bangor, Washington.
Yeah.
Take out the Tridents. Number 3, Savannah. Take out the Tridents. All the Tridents are based in Bangor and Savannah. That's 1, 2, 3. What's the problem other than the fact that it's an explosion? For us personally, we won't die in the explosion. It's too far away. Are you kidding me? When I visited the Trident Submarine National Museum in Tucson, Arizona, and looked at the Trident II missile with a 1 megaton warhead on it, there was a selector switch there in the control room, and it said air burst, ground burst. Oh, okay. So when you're trying to use a weapon of mass destruction, you go over Washington, D.C., you use an airburst, because that kills most people, the biggest. If you're at Bangor, Washington, you used the ground burst. Because those submarines, I don't care how hardened they are, I don't care what kind of concrete pen they're in, I don't care how deep the nuclear bombs are stored, it's all going to be gone. The problem with that is that huge quantity, tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of everything, steel, earth, concrete, all going to be powder. It's all going to go to 60,000 feet up in the air, and it's all going to come this way, and the deposit itself. Now, not just here, it's going to go to Canada, it's going to go, we're going to be so radioactive. Just, you know, kiss your kids, hold your wife's hand, do whatever you want. We're all gone. Thank you so much, I enjoyed talking to you.